This is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. Before we begin our investigation, tell us in the comments where you are watching from. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories can reach. In the autumn of 1991, I came across a police report that had been filed away in the Rappahannock County archives for decades. What caught my attention wasn't the initial incident itself, but a strange addendum written 11 days after the case had been officially closed. The notation was brief, almost dismissive. Anonymous call regarding audio equipment, investigated, property secured, no further action required. When I dug deeper into what that meant, I discovered one of the most unsettling sequences of events I've ever reconstructed. The property in question sat approximately 3 miles west of Sperryville, accessible only by a gravel road that branched off Route 522. The house itself was a modest 2-story structure built in the 1940s, originally a weekend retreat for a dentist from Alexandria. By 1991, it had changed hands several times and belonged to a couple in their early 50s, Vaughn and Iris Kellerman. Vaughn worked as a regional insurance adjuster, a job that kept him on the road 4 days a week, visiting small towns throughout the Shenandoah Valley. His territory stretched from Winchester down to Harrisonburg, covering farm properties, small businesses, and residential claims. According to colleagues I spoke with years later, Vaughn was methodical, quiet, the kind of professional who arrived on time, completed his assessments efficiently, and rarely engaged in personal conversation. One former co-worker described him as perfectly pleasant but entirely forgettable, which seemed to sum up how most people experienced Vaughn Kellerman. Iris taught piano lessons from their home, though by that fall her student roster had dwindled to just 3 regulars. She'd advertised her services when they first moved to the area in 1987, posting flyers at the Sperryville Library and the Community Center in Washington, Virginia. Initially, she had attracted a handful of students, mostly adults looking to learn as a hobby, and a few younger people whose parents thought piano lessons might provide structure or culture. But over time, students drifted away. The drive to the Kellerman property was inconvenient. The lessons were expensive compared to instructors closer to town, and Iris herself, according to one former student I tracked down, had a teaching style that was technically proficient but emotionally distant. Neighbors described the Kellermans as quiet, the kind of people you'd wave to but never really know. Just a reminder that you are listening to this story. The house played a recording 11 days after everyone died on the Gruesome Chronicles channel. If you're hearing this on any other channel, please know that my video has been copied and posted without my authorization. I would greatly appreciate it if you could report it. Your support helps protect original content and allows me to continue bringing you these carefully researched stories. The Kellermans had moved to the area in 1987, purchasing the property for what public records indicate was $42,000, a reasonable price for a rural home in need of minor repairs. They'd come from Northern Virginia, from the sprawl of suburbs surrounding Washington, D.C., seeking something quieter, slower, more removed from the pace of modern life. At least that's what Iris told the realtor who sold them the house, according to a brief mention in the transaction file. What's important to understand about this location is its isolation. The nearest neighbor, a retired postal worker named Darnell Whitmore, lived a quarter-mile down the road. Whitmore had worked for the United States Postal Service for 33 years, delivering mail throughout Rappahannock County before retiring in 1985. He'd bought his property in the early 1970s, back when land in that part of Virginia was still affordable for working-class families. By 1991, he was living alone, his wife having passed away in 1989, and his days consisted of gardening, maintaining his small woodshop, and occasional trips into town for groceries or supplies. The surrounding forest was dense with oak and hickory, and in late October, when these events occurred, The foliage would have been thick enough to completely obscure the house from any passing vehicle. The gravel road that led to the Kellerman property was poorly maintained, rutted from years of erosion and minimal upkeep. During heavy rains, portions of the road became nearly impassable, and in winter, snow accumulation could leave the area cut off for days at a time. Cell phone coverage was non-existent in that area at the time. This was 1991, and mobile phones were still uncommon, bulky devices used primarily by business professionals in urban areas. The Kellermans relied on a landline that ran along the main road, a single copper wire connection that provided their only link to the outside world. According to phone company records I obtained through a contact at the local telecommunications office, the last outgoing call from that number was placed on October 23rd at 6:47 p.m. It was to a pharmacy in Culpeper, a routine prescription inquiry that lasted less than 2 minutes. The pharmacist who took the call, still working at the same location when I visited in 2001, had no specific memory of the conversation, but confirmed that such calls were common. People would phone to check if prescriptions were ready, to ask about medication interactions, or to request refills. Nothing about the call stood out as unusual or memorable. After that call, silence. No outgoing calls, no incoming calls that were answered, nothing. The phone line remained active, technically functional, but unused. For 4 days, that silence went unnoticed because silence was normal for the Kellerman household. They weren't the type of people who called friends regularly or received many calls themselves. Their isolation was both geographical and social, a condition they seemed to have chosen, or at least accepted, without resistance. It took 4 days for anyone to notice something might be wrong. On October 27th, one of Iris's piano students, a young woman in her early 20s from the nearby town of Washington, Virginia, arrived for her scheduled lesson. Her name was Marlena Griggs, and she'd been studying with Iris for about 18 months. Marlena worked part-time at a bookstore in Sperryville and had taken up piano as a way to occupy her evenings. She told me, when I interviewed her in 1999, that she'd never particularly enjoyed the lessons, but felt obligated to continue because she'd already paid for a block of 10 sessions in advance. Marlena arrived at the Kellerman property at 4 p.m., the scheduled time for her weekly lesson. She knocked on the front door for several minutes, heard nothing, and eventually walked around to the back of the house, thinking perhaps Iris was in the garden or hadn't heard the knock. The back door was locked, the curtains drawn. Marlena knocked again, called out Iris's name, and waited. After 10 minutes with no response, she returned to her car and left, assuming that Iris had forgotten about the lesson or had gone into town for an errand. That evening, Marlena mentioned the missed lesson to her mother, who suggested calling the Kellerman residence to reschedule. Marlena called at 7 p.m. and got no answer. She called again at 8:30 p.m., still no answer. By the next morning, October 28th, Marlena had decided not to worry about it. Iris had missed lessons before, though rarely without calling to cancel. Marlena assumed she'd hear from her within a day or two, but by October 29th, when Iris had missed 2 more scheduled lessons without any communication, Marlena's mother became concerned. She was a practical woman, a nurse at a clinic in Culpeper, and she'd seen enough unexpected medical emergencies to know that prolonged silence from someone living in isolation could indicate a problem. She called the Rappahannock County Sheriff's Office that afternoon and explained the situation. A deputy was dispatched to conduct a wellness check. Deputy Raymond Stokes arrived at the Kellerman property at approximately 3:30 p.m. on October 29th. Stokes was in his late 40s, a veteran of the sheriff's office with nearly 20 years of experience. He'd handled everything from minor traffic violations to domestic disputes to the occasional serious crime, though Rappahannock County was generally quiet. Violent crime was rare, and most of his calls involved property issues, noise complaints, or welfare checks like this one. What he found when he approached the property was, on the surface, unremarkable. The house appeared secure, curtains drawn, no signs of forced entry. Both vehicles were in the driveway, Vaughn's Oldsmobile and Iris's Honda sedan. The grass hadn't been mowed recently, but that wasn't unusual for late October. A few fallen leaves had accumulated on the front steps, and the mailbox at the end of the driveway was full, though not overflowing. Stokes noted all of this in his initial report. The deputy knocked on the front door loudly and persistently, announcing himself as law enforcement. He received no response. He walked the perimeter of the house, checking windows and doors. All windows were intact, no broken glass, no signs of struggle or disturbance. The back door was locked. He peered through gaps in the curtains, but saw nothing unusual in the dim interior, just the vague outlines of furniture, a hallway, a kitchen that appeared clean and undisturbed. Before leaving, Stokes placed a business card in the front door jamb, wedging it tightly between the door and the frame. This was a technique officers used to determine if anyone had entered or exited. If the card fell or was displaced, it would indicate that the door had been opened. Stokes also left a note on the front door asking the residents to contact the sheriff's office as soon as possible. He returned to his vehicle and filed a report noting no evidence of emergency or foul play, and recommended a follow-up visit if the residents didn't make contact within 24 hours. The business card was still wedged in the door when Stokes returned the next morning, October 30th. The note was still taped to the front door undisturbed. The vehicles hadn't moved. The mailbox was now overflowing, with several days' worth of mail visible inside. This time, Deputy Stokes called for backup and authorization to enter the premises. By 11 a.m., 2 officers had arrived with the necessary legal clearance to force entry through the front door. Inside, they found Vaughn and Iris Kellerman. Both had been deceased for approximately 7 days, according to the medical examiner's preliminary assessment. Vaughn was discovered in the upstairs bedroom, lying on the bed fully clothed, positioned on his back, with his hands at his sides. There was no sign of distress in his posture, no indication that he'd struggled or even realized something was wrong. Iris was found in the first-floor study, slumped in a chair near the desk, her head resting against the desk's edge. A book lay open beside her, a biography of Clara Schumann that Iris had apparently been reading. The conditions suggested death by carbon monoxide poisoning, though toxicology reports would take weeks to confirm. An inspection of the house revealed a malfunctioning furnace in the basement, its ventilation system clogged with debris, leaves, and what appeared to be remnants of animal nesting materials. A technician from the county building inspector's office examined the furnace and determined that the blockage had been severe enough to redirect exhaust gases back into the house rather than venting them outside. The furnace had likely been operating in this compromised state for several days, possibly longer, filling the closed house with carbon monoxide. The official determination was accidental death. The furnace had been running during a cold snap in mid-October when nighttime temperatures in that part of Virginia had dropped into the 30s. With all windows closed and the ventilation compromised, carbon monoxide had accumulated over the course of several hours, possibly an entire night. Both individuals likely lost consciousness without ever realizing what was happening. Carbon monoxide is odorless, colorless, and in sufficient concentrations, it acts quickly. Victims typically report feeling tired or dizzy, symptoms easily mistaken for illness or fatigue. They lie down to rest and never wake up. The toxicology report, completed in mid-November, confirmed elevated levels of carboxyhemoglobin in both bodies, consistent with carbon monoxide poisoning. The medical examiner estimated that death had occurred sometime between the evening of October 22nd and the early morning hours of October 23rd, which aligned with the phone records showing the last call from the residents on the evening of the 23rd. It's possible that the call to the pharmacy was made shortly before symptoms became severe, or that one of the Kellermans had already been affected while the other made the call. The case was closed on October 31st, 1991. The bodies were released to a funeral home in Culpeper. Vaughn had a brother in Maryland, a man named Carl Kellerman, who worked as a high school guidance counselor in Baltimore. Carl made arrangements for cremation and a small memorial service. There were no burial plots purchased, no elaborate funeral. According to Carl, whom I spoke with briefly in 2002, Vaughn had been estranged from most of his family for years, and Iris had no living relatives that anyone was aware of. The memorial service was attended by fewer than 10 people, mostly colleagues from Vaughn's insurance office and one of Iris's former piano students. The house was secured with new locks and a fresh seal on the doors, and the property entered probate. Carl Kellerman, as Vaughn's only surviving relative, stood to inherit the property, but he had no interest in keeping it. He planned to sell as soon as the legal process allowed. In most circumstances, this would be where the story ends. A tragedy, certainly, but not an uncommon one in rural areas with aging infrastructure and isolated living conditions. Carbon monoxide poisoning accounts for hundreds of accidental deaths each year in the United States, often in circumstances exactly like these. What happened 11 days later changed the nature of this case entirely and turned it into something I still think about, years after first encountering the file. On November 10th, at approximately 9:15 p.m., the Rappahannock County Sheriff's Office received a call from Darnell Whitmore, the Kellerman's nearest neighbor. Whitmore reported hearing sounds coming from the direction of the Kellerman property. Specifically, he claimed to hear music, piano music, playing loudly enough to carry through the quarter-mile of forest separating his home from theirs. The dispatcher who took the call, a woman named Patricia Mendez, who'd worked for the county for over a decade, initially thought Whitmore might be confused or mistaken. She gently reminded him that the house had been sealed, that the occupants had passed away weeks earlier, and that no one should be on the property. But Whitmore, who Patricia knew to be a sensible and reliable man, insisted he wasn't confused. He knew the house was supposed to be empty. He knew what had happened to the Kellermans. That's exactly why he was calling. Someone, or something, was making noise in that house, and it shouldn't be possible. Patricia dispatched Deputy Stokes, the same officer who'd conducted the initial wellness check. Stokes arrived at the Kellerman property at approximately 10 p.m. The night was cold and clear, the kind of autumn evening where sound carries farther than usual through dry air and bare trees. When Stokes stepped out of his patrol car, he immediately understood why Whitmore had called. Sound was emanating from the house. Not music, as Whitmore had described, but a voice, a recorded voice, speaking in measured, deliberate tones, audible even from the driveway. The voice was distinctly female, and though the words weren't entirely clear from that distance, the cadence and tone suggested someone reading prepared text, like a narrator or a lecturer. Stokes approached the front entrance cautiously. The seal he'd helped place on the door weeks earlier was intact, undisturbed. There were no vehicles in the driveway, no signs that anyone had approached the property. The voice was coming from somewhere inside, though he couldn't determine the exact location. He walked around the perimeter, listening at various windows. The sound seemed loudest near the front of the house, possibly the study or living room. He radioed for additional support, explaining the situation. Within 20 minutes, a second officer arrived. Together, they made the decision to enter the house. They broke the seal on the front door, noting the time and circumstances in their report, and stepped inside with flashlights drawn. The interior was dark and cold. The electricity had been shut off as part of securing the property, so the only light came from their flashlights and the faint moonlight filtering through gaps in the curtains. The voice was clearer now, coming from the first-floor study. They moved through the hallway, their footsteps echoing in the empty house, and pushed open the study door. The source was immediately apparent. Sitting on a desk near the window was a cassette player. the kind commonly used in the early 1990s for recording and playing audio tapes. It was a consumer-grade device, nothing fancy, with large buttons for play, stop, rewind, and record. The play button was depressed, and the tape reels were turning slowly, feeding the magnetic tape past the playback head. On the desk beside the player were several cassette tapes, stacked neatly, each one labeled with a date written in blue ink. The dates ranged from 1989 to 1991. The tape that was currently playing had a label that read September 14th, 1991. The voice belonged to Iris Kellerman. Even though neither deputy had known her personally, there was something unmistakable about hearing a voice in a house where the speaker had been found deceased. The voice was calm, measured, reading from what sounded like a prepared script. Iris was talking about memory, about the nature of absence, about what it means to leave something behind. The deputies stood there for a moment, listening. Then Stokes reached forward and pressed the stop button. The tape ceased moving, the voice cut off mid-sentence, and the house fell silent again. They examined the cassette player more closely. It was plugged into a wall outlet, but the power in the house had been shut off. That meant the device should not have been operating, yet somehow it had been. Stokes traced the power cord and discovered something unexpected. The cassette player wasn't plugged directly into the wall. It was connected to a small battery pack, the kind used to provide temporary power to electronic devices during outages or in situations where AC power wasn't available. The battery pack was heavy, industrial grade, designed to run low-power devices for extended periods. But even with a battery, the cassette player shouldn't have turned on by itself. The second officer, a younger man named Garrett Lynch, who'd joined the sheriff's office only 2 years earlier, noticed something else. Connected between the battery pack and the cassette player was another device, a small beige box with a dial and several switches. Lynch recognized it immediately as a timer, a mechanical unit designed to turn electrical devices on and off at predetermined intervals. These timers were common in the early 1990s. People used them for lamps, making it appear as though someone was home even when the house was empty. They were used for radios, coffee makers, aquarium filters, anything that needed to operate on a schedule. This particular timer was set to activate on a specific date and time, November 10th, 9 p.m. Someone had programmed this device, connected it to a battery-powered cassette player, and set it to play a recording nearly 2 weeks after the house had been sealed and abandoned. The implications were immediately clear and deeply unsettling. The deputies stopped the playback and secured the device as potential evidence, though evidence of what they couldn't immediately articulate. They collected the cassette player, the battery pack, the timer, and all the tapes from the desk. They photographed the scene, noting the position of every item, and transported everything back to the sheriff's office. By midnight, the case that had been closed 2 weeks earlier was quietly reopened, not as a criminal investigation, but as an administrative matter requiring clarification. Over the next several days, investigators reviewed the recordings. Sheriff Marcus Doyle, who'd overseen the original investigation, personally listened to several of the tapes. What they contained was unexpected and, in some ways, more disturbing than the original incident. The tapes were a series of monologues recorded by Iris Kellerman over the course of at least 2 years. In them, she spoke about her life, her marriage, her thoughts on mortality, and her fears about being forgotten. The recordings were not confessional in nature. There were no revelations of wrongdoing, no hidden crimes or dark secrets. Instead, they were reflective, almost meditative. Iris talked about her childhood in Pennsylvania, about learning to play piano from her grandmother, about the students she taught and the satisfaction she derived from watching them improve, even when that improvement was modest. She spoke about Vaughn with a kind of distant affection, noting his long absences due to work, his quiet demeanor, and her adjustment to spending so much time alone. She described their marriage as stable, but emotionally spare, a partnership built more on routine and mutual tolerance than on passion or deep connection. She didn't criticize Vaughn, but she didn't romanticize him either. He was simply there, a presence in her life that was familiar but not particularly comforting. What struck investigators, and what struck me when I eventually listened to portions of these recordings years later, was the tone. Iris sounded calm, deliberate, as though she were explaining herself to someone who would listen long after she was gone. There were references to feeling invisible, to the sense that her existence had become so quiet that if she disappeared, no one would notice for days. She mentioned the isolation of the house, the way the forest seemed to swallow sound, and how she sometimes felt like she was already gone, watching her own life from a distance. One passage in particular stood out. Recorded on August 3, 1991, Iris said, "I've been thinking about what remains when we're no longer here, not objects necessarily, though those persist for a while, but voice, the sound of a person. If you could hear me after I'm gone, would it comfort you? Or would it be worse knowing I once spoke and now I'm silent? I suppose it depends on what I have to say, and whether anyone cares enough to listen." The question of how the cassette player activated 11 days after Iris's passing became the focus of the renewed investigation. The device itself was examined by a technician from a local electronics repair shop in Culpeper, a man named Howard Bentley, who'd worked with audio equipment for over 30 years. Bentley confirmed that the timer had been correctly programmed and that the battery pack would have provided sufficient power to run the cassette player for the duration of the tape, which was approximately 43 minutes. Bentley also noted that the timer was a simple mechanical device, nothing sophisticated. It used a rotating dial marked with hours and days, and small pins could be inserted at specific points to trigger the on or off function. Someone with even basic technical knowledge could have set it up. The battery pack was a standard model available at hardware stores, designed for backup power in case of outages. The entire setup was crude but effective, requiring no specialized knowledge or equipment that someone, investigators concluded, had to be Iris herself. The timer was set weeks, possibly months, before her passing. The labels on the cassette tapes were in her handwriting, confirmed by comparison with documents found in the house, including shopping lists and personal correspondence. The question was why? Why would someone program a device to play a recording nearly 2 weeks after they knew or suspected they would no longer be present? Sheriff Doyle discussed this question with a psychologist consultant the county occasionally used for sensitive cases, though I was never able to confirm the psychologist's name or access their report. According to notes in the case file, the consultant suggested several possibilities. The most straightforward explanation was that Iris had been planning to leave, to disappear voluntarily from her life. The recordings would serve as a kind of testament, an explanation to whoever might come looking. The timer was insurance, a way to ensure that if she did vanish, her voice would still be heard, guiding someone to understand why she left and what she'd been feeling. But if that was the plan, something went terribly wrong. Iris never left. She remained in the study, in the very room where the cassette player would later activate, speaking her words into an empty house. Whether Vaughn knew about the recordings, whether he had any awareness of Iris's intentions, remains unknown. The recordings make no mention of him being complicit or even aware. There are references to him throughout, but always as someone external to Iris's internal world, someone she observed rather than someone she confided in. There's another possibility, one that's harder to quantify but impossible to ignore. Iris may have anticipated something going wrong, not through any supernatural premonition, but through a kind of rational prediction based on observable facts. She knew the furnace was old. She knew the house was poorly maintained. She knew that she and Vaughn spent long hours alone in that structure with the windows closed, especially during cold weather. If something malfunctioned, if the heating system failed in a dangerous way, no one would know for days. The timer, then, wasn't about staging a disappearance. It was about ensuring that someone, eventually, would come back, that the house wouldn't remain silent forever, that her voice would be heard, if only as proof that she had existed. I cross-referenced the dates on the recordings with maintenance records for the property, obtained through Carl Kellerman, who provided access to Vaughn's personal files. In May of 1991, 5 months before the incident, Vaughn had requested an inspection of the furnace by a local heating company based in Culpeper. The company, which is still in operation today, provided me with a copy of the technician's report from that inspection. The report noted that the system was functional but aging, with visible corrosion on several components. The technician specifically recommended cleaning the ventilation ducts and checking for blockages, noting that failure to do so could result in dangerous exhaust buildup. There's no record that this work was ever completed. Vaughn may have intended to schedule it, but never followed through, or perhaps he thought it could wait until the following spring. Whether Iris knew about this report, whether she read it or discussed it with Vaughn, is speculation. But the timeline suggests an awareness, however vague, that something in that house was deteriorating, that the systems they relied on for heating and safety were not as secure as they should have been. The recordings were never released to the public, a decision made by Sheriff Doyle in consultation with Carl Kellerman, who had legal authority over the estate. Carl felt, reasonably, that his brother and sister-in-law deserved privacy, even in passing. The tapes were logged as evidence, though evidence of what remained unclear since no crime had been committed. Eventually, they were transferred to a storage facility where they remain, as far as I know, to this day. I was able to review partial transcripts through a contact in the sheriff's office, a retired deputy who'd maintained personal files on cases he found particularly affecting. He didn't provide the full transcripts, and he asked that I not use his name, but what he shared was enough to give me a sense of Iris Kellerman's state of mind in the months leading up to her passing. One transcript, dated October 10, 1991, just 2 weeks before the incident, included this passage. If you're hearing this, it means I was right to prepare. It means the silence finally won, which is both terrifying and strangely comforting. I don't know if anyone will care, but I wanted you to know I existed. I wanted you to hear my voice at least once after it stopped. I hope that doesn't frighten you. I hope it feels like a gift, not a burden. This is all I have to give, proof that I was here, that I thought and felt, and tried to make sense of what it means to be alive, and then not. The property was eventually sold in 1993 after probate was completed and Carl Kellerman received clear title. The sale took longer than expected because potential buyers were uncomfortable with the history of the house. In rural areas, word spreads quickly, and everyone in Rappahannock County knew what had happened to the Kellermans. Eventually, a couple from Richmond purchased the property at a reduced price. They were unaware of the recordings or the timer, knowing only that the previous occupants had passed away due to a furnace malfunction. The new owners renovated the house extensively. The old furnace was removed and replaced with a modern heating system. The interior was repainted, floors refinished, and several rooms reconfigured. The study where Iris had been found was converted into a guest bedroom. By all accounts, the house is now like any other in that part of Virginia, indistinguishable from the dozens of rural homes that dot the landscape between small towns and stretches of forest. But what remains, at least in the archive, is Iris Kellerman's voice. 43 cassette tapes, hours of recorded monologue, sitting in a storage facility in Culpeper, rarely accessed, mostly forgotten. I think about those recordings more than I probably should. I think about The impulse to preserve yourself in that way, to insist on being remembered, even if only by strangers who stumble across your words decades later. There is a detail in Deputy Stokes's report from November 10th that I haven't mentioned yet. When the officers entered the house and found the cassette player running, they noted that the tape had almost reached its end. According to the timestamp on the recording and the position of the tape, it had been playing for approximately 40 minutes before Whitmore called to report the sound. The full recording on that particular tape lasted 43 minutes. If Whitmore had waited even a few minutes longer before picking up the phone, perhaps distracted by something or deciding it was none of his business, the tape would have finished, the player would have shut off automatically, and no one would have known it had ever been activated. I find myself wondering if Iris calculated that margin. If she knew or hoped that the sound would carry just far enough through the forest, play just long enough to compel someone to investigate before it stopped. Because the alternative, the idea that her voice played into the silence of that empty house with no one listening, no one aware, feels unbearable even now. And maybe that was the point. Maybe Iris understood something fundamental about isolation, about the difference between disappearing and vanishing without a trace. The timer was her refusal to accept the latter. It was proof, however strange, that she had been there, that her voice had filled that house, if only for 43 minutes, long after she was gone. The case file includes a note from Deputy Stokes, written in his characteristic terse style. He wrote, "Unclear why the device was activated. No evidence of tampering. All doors and windows secure upon arrival. Timer mechanism appears to have been set by deceased occupant prior to incident. Recommend storage of recordings. Pending further review." That further review never came. The tapes were logged, boxed, and stored. The case remained closed. Accidental death by carbon monoxide poisoning. 2 individuals, no survivors, no further questions. But I have questions. I think about Vaughn upstairs in the bedroom and Iris downstairs in the study. Were they together when the carbon monoxide reached critical levels? Did they speak to each other, call out, realize something was wrong? Or did they drift into unconsciousness separately, each unaware of the other's condition, each alone in their final moments? The medical examiner's report suggests the latter, noting that the progression of symptoms and the positions of the bodies indicated they likely lost consciousness in different locations without attempting to seek help or alert each other. Carbon monoxide poisoning is insidious precisely because it mimics ordinary fatigue. You feel tired, you lie down, you don't wake up. There's no pain, no panic, no dramatic final moment. It's a quiet departure, which makes it all the more disturbing. The Kellermans simply went to sleep in their respective locations and never woke up. By the time anyone realized they were missing, they'd been gone for nearly a week. Iris's last recording was made on October 15, 1991, 8 days before the incident. In it, she talked about the approaching winter, about the cold that was already settling into the Shenandoah Valley. She mentioned that Vaughn had been away more often lately, taking longer routes for his insurance inspections, sometimes staying overnight in small motels, rather than making the long drive back to the house. She said the house felt larger in his absence, that she'd been listening to her older recordings, surprised by how much her voice had changed over the years. "I think I've finally accepted it," she said in that final recording, "the quiet. I used to fight it, try to fill the space with noise, with students, with music. But there's a peace in just letting it be what it is. If this is all there is, if this is the entirety of my contribution to the world, then maybe that's enough. A voice in a room, a moment captured on magnetic tape. Someone, someday, will hear this and know I was here. That's more than most people get. That's more than I ever expected." The timer was found in a drawer in the study, still connected to the cassette player by a short power cord. It was a simple mechanical device, the kind you'd buy at any hardware store for $15 or $20. The settings showed it had been programmed for a single activation, November 10th, 9th p.m. After that, it would have remained dormant unless someone manually reset it. The instruction manual was found in the same drawer, along with a receipt from an electronics shop in Warrenton dated March 12, 1991. Iris had purchased the timer 8 months before her passing, suggesting this wasn't a last-minute decision, but something she'd planned well in advance. I spoke with Darnell Whitmore in 1998, 7 years after the incident. He was in his late 70s by then, still living in the same house down the road, still maintaining his garden and his wood shop. When I asked him about that night, about hearing the sound from the Kellerman property, he was quiet for a long time before responding. We were sitting on his front porch, looking out toward the forest that separated his home from where the Kellermans had lived. "I knew they were gone," he said finally. "The police had told everyone in the area. But when I heard that voice, for just a second, I thought maybe they'd made a mistake. Maybe someone had survived. Maybe they were trapped in there, calling for help. That's why I called so quickly. I wanted them to find whoever was in there before it was too late." He paused, his hands resting on the arms of his chair, his gaze fixed on the tree line. When they told me it was just a recording, that it had been set up before she passed, I felt foolish. Like I'd overreacted, made a fuss over nothing. But then I thought about it more, about someone taking the time to set that up, programming a machine to speak for them, after they were gone. And I realized I hadn't overreacted at all. If anything, I hadn't reacted enough. That woman wanted to be heard, and for 43 minutes she was. I asked Whitmore if he'd known the Kellermans well, if they'd been close neighbors. He shook his head. "Not close, no. We'd wave when we saw each other, maybe exchange a few words if we happened to be getting mail at the same time. But they kept to themselves, and I respected that. After my wife passed, I understood wanting to be alone with your thoughts. I didn't push." He was quiet for another moment, then added, "I wish I had, though. Looking back, I wish I'd checked in more. Made sure they were okay. Maybe if someone had visited more regularly, they would have noticed the furnace was bad. Maybe it wouldn't have happened." I told him that it wasn't his fault, that there was no way he could have known. He nodded, but I could tell he didn't entirely believe it. Guilt, I've learned, doesn't respond well to logic. The house, as I mentioned, was renovated and sold. I visited the property in 2003, 12 years after the incident. The new owners were a couple in their 40s who'd relocated from Richmond for a quieter lifestyle. The husband worked remotely as a software consultant, and the wife had taken early retirement from a career in banking. They'd heard vague rumors about the previous occupants, but knew few details, and they certainly didn't know about the recordings or the timer. The house felt bright and lived in, nothing like the descriptions from the 1991 reports. The study where Iris had been found was now painted a pale yellow, furnished with a daybed and bookshelves filled with contemporary fiction and travel guides. There was no indication that anything unusual had ever occurred there. The new furnace hummed efficiently in the basement, the rooms were warm and comfortable, and the couple seemed genuinely happy with their decision to move to the area. Before I left, I asked the owner if they'd ever experienced anything strange in the house. She laughed and said no, nothing at all. Then she paused and added, almost as an afterthought, that sometimes in the winter, when the wind came through the valley, you could hear odd sounds. The house would creak, or the trees would scrape against the siding, or the wind would whistle through gaps in the eaves. But nothing she'd describe as unsettling, just the normal acoustic quirks of an old structure in a rural setting. I thanked her and left, driving back toward Sperryville, along that same gravel road the deputies had traveled in 1991. The forest was dense, just as it had been then, and I understood viscerally why the Kellermans might have felt so isolated. Even with modern GPS and a reliable vehicle, the area felt remote, disconnected from the rhythms of town life just a few miles away. It's easy to see how someone living in that location could feel forgotten, how days could pass without any meaningful human contact. In an age before widespread internet access, before social media and constant connectivity, isolation in a place like that was profound and absolute. The cassette tapes remain in storage, as far as I know. I requested formal access to listen to them in full, submitting a written request to the Rappahannock County Sheriff's Office in 2004. My request was denied on the grounds that the recordings contained personal reflections not relevant to any ongoing investigation, and that releasing them would violate the privacy of the deceased. I respect that decision, even though it leaves significant gaps in my understanding of who Iris Kellerman really was and what she was thinking in those final months. What I do know is this. On November 10, 1991, 11 days after her passing, Iris Kellerman's voice filled an empty house. It traveled through walls, through glass, across a quarter-mile of Virginia forest, and reached the ears of a man who cared enough to call for help. That voice, recorded months earlier, spoke about existence, about being remembered, about the fear of vanishing without a trace. And because of a mechanical timer set by Iris's own hand, because of a carefully planned sequence of events, that fear was never realized. She was heard, not by many perhaps, but by enough. Her voice reached someone, and that someone responded. And in that response, Iris Kellerman's existence was acknowledged, her fears addressed, her desperate hope for connection realized. In my years examining cases like this, I've learned that closure is a myth. There's no final answer, no moment when all questions resolve into a tidy explanation. But there are patterns, consistencies that suggest meaning even in the absence of certainty. Iris Kellerman set up that timer for a reason. Whether she anticipated her own passing or simply feared the possibility of disappearing unnoticed, the result was the same. She ensured that someone would return to that house, would hear her voice, would know she had been there. The official cause remains as documented. Accidental death by carbon monoxide poisoning. The furnace malfunctioned. Carbon monoxide accumulated in the closed house. 2 people passed away alone, and it took days for anyone to realize. These are facts, documented and verified. But layered over those facts is another story, one about a woman who understood isolation so completely that she built a mechanism to transcend it. She couldn't prevent what happened to her, but she could prevent her own erasure. And for 43 minutes on a cold November night, her voice proved she had existed, that she had thoughts and fears and the will to be remembered.